Laudetur Jesus Christus.
In the headlines this Wednesday, June 29th, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. Pope Francis decries barbaric attacks in Ukraine and calls for an end to the war. The Pope issues a new document demanding an end to battles over liturgy and calling for rediscovering its beauty. And the Archbishop of San Antonio, Texas, speaks to Vatican Radio about the many migrants who have died in the past days following their hope for a better life. In the Vatican, I'm Deborah Castellano-Lubov. On Tuesday, international headlines told of the 51 Mexican and Central American migrants who perished in an abandoned truck trailer. They were stifled to death due to no air conditioning or water, abandoned on a lonely road in San Antonio, Texas. This tragedy marks the worst ever people smuggling tragedy spanning the border between the United States and Mexico. The Pope had issued a tweet saying, I sorrowfully heard the news of the migrant tragedy, and saying, let's pray together for these brothers and sisters who died following their hope of a better life. James Blears reports.
The truck, coupled to a trailer, had sneaked through a border checkpoint to the northeast of Laredo, Texas. With mechanical failures, it was cruelly and callously abandoned on the outskirts of San Antonio, leaving those inside the sweltering container to their sealed fates. The city worker heard faint and pitiful cries for help, and the full extent of inhumanity was then discovered. 46 corpses and a dozen near-to-death survivors, including 4 children, suffering from acute dehydration, exhaustion and severe heat stroke, were rushed to hospital where 5 couldn't be saved and died. So far, the death count is 22 Mexicans, 7 Guatemalans and 2 Hondurans. More remain to be formally identified. San Antonio Mayor Ron Nirenberg called it a horror and a preventable tragedy. President Joe Biden called it heartbreaking. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador says poverty and desperation caused this. Mexican Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard confirms a team from Mexico has joined the investigation. Inhumane smuggling is a major source of income for drug cartels. Organized crime has caused this appalling crime, in which people were entombed in a metal box in desperate search of better lives in the United States. The time for the condolences via words is now over. The moment for real action in their memory is the #1 priority. A change of attitudes to replace platitudes. For Vatican Radio, James Blears reporting.
Sticking always with this tragic story, the Archbishop of San Antonio, Archbishop Garcia Siller, spoke to Francesca Merlo upon his return from the children's hospitals.
It was very sad to go and visit patients that they didn't have their names. It's a part of it, part of the story of the migrants and the plight is that they are like nobody, non-existence. The people at the hospitals, they are treating them very well. Of course, in all the places the law enforcement was present because it's now under federal investigation. But there's the pain, the suffering, but it's a story of the immigrants, migrants, and sometimes refugees in the southern border with the United States. We received a beautiful message of solidarity from the Holy Father, expressing his prayers and calling people to a change of heart, calling people to think how to do better so that these situations that will not happen. They have been very common in Texas.
What can be done to obtain this change of heart that the Holy Father calls for? What can we do?
Well, what we can do first is to recognize what happened. We cannot just let these situations to go by. Life matters. We need to grasp any sign of hope and to multiply it by God's grace. We know that God will multiply any sign of hope.
That was Archbishop Garcia Siller of San Antonio, Texas, speaking to Francesca Merlo of Vatican News. Following his midday Angelus prayer for the feast day, Pope Francis decried continued barbaric attacks in Ukraine and condemned the bombing of a shopping center, which killed civilians earlier this week. The Holy Father prayed that God might open the path to dialogue as the war wages on in Ukraine. He also made an appeal to protect creation after Roman fires wreaked havoc in recent days. Devin Watkins tells us more.
Pope Francis today appealed for dialogue and an end to the war in Ukraine as a Russian missile strike struck a shopping mall in the central city of Kremenchuk. He made the appeal after the Angelus prayer for the feast of Saints Peter and Paul.
Porto ogni giorno nel cuore la cara e martoriata Ucraina.
Every day, the Pope said, I carry in my heart the dear and tormented Ukraine, which continues to be scourged by barbaric attacks, such as the one that struck the Kremenchuk shopping center. At least 18 people were killed on Monday in what Kiev said was a direct Russian missile strike against the busy shopping center. The G7 called the strike a Russian war crime, while Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russia of directly targeting civilians. Moscow rejected those accounts, saying it had hit a legitimate military target in the city and that the shopping center was not in use. In his appeal, Pope Francis called for nations to come to the assistance of the Ukrainian people, who he said are suffering so much.
Prego questa folle guerra possa vedere presto la fine.
I pray that this mad war may soon see an end, and I renew the invitation to persevere without tiring in prayer for peace, he said. May the Lord open paths of dialogue that men are unable or unwilling to find. Separately, Pope Francis also appealed for the protection of the environment following a series of fires that broke out in Rome in recent days as the Italian capital smolders in extreme heat. He pointed out that in many places, drought is now a serious problem which is causing serious damage to production activities and the environment. The Pope expressed his hope that the necessary measures will be put in place to deal with these emergencies and to prevent future emergencies.
Non è una moda, è una responsabilità.
All this, he said, must make us reflect on the protection of creation. It is not a fad, he concluded, but a responsibility. The future of the earth is in our hands and our decisions. I'm Devin Watkins.
Pope Francis blessed the Palio for the new metropolitan archbishops on the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, and he presided at the Mass for the solemnity, which was celebrated by Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, Dean of the College of Cardinals. In his homily, Pope Francis reminded the faithful that the Church is called to get up quickly and to fight the good fights. Christopher Wells reports.
In his homily, Pope Francis reflected on the meaning of two phrases from the day's readings and what they mean for today's Christian community engaged in the synodal process. The first is from the Acts of the Apostles. St. Peter, the Pope recalled, had been imprisoned by Herod when an angel appeared to him, woke him, and ordered him to get up quickly. For Peter, this was the beginning of his escape from Herod's jail. Well, for the Church, the command to get up quickly stands as a call to enter into the mystery of the resurrection and allow the Lord to guide us along the paths he wishes to point out to us. The second phrase comes from St. Paul's letter to Timothy, where, looking back on his whole life, the apostle says, I have fought the good fight. St. Paul sees that fight going on throughout history, since many people are not disposed to accept Jesus. Pope Francis said Paul's exhortation is also a word of life for us today, helping us to realize that we are all called to be missionary disciples, with everyone offering their own contribution. The Pope then posed two questions for modern Christians. First, he said, we must ask ourselves, what can I do for the Church? He warned against complaining about the Church and invited the faithful instead to participate in the Church's work with passion and humility. This, he said, is what a synodal church means. Everyone has a part to play, no individual in the place of others or above others. Then he said we should ask, what can we do together as Church to make the world in which we live more humane, just, and solidary, more open to God and to fraternity among people? This does not mean retreating into ecclesial circles, he said, but instead helping one another to be leaven in the dough of the world. In a word, he said, we're called to be a church that promotes the culture of care and compassion toward the vulnerable. Finally, recalling the fine tradition of the blessing of the Pallia, Pope Francis reminded the archbishops that they too are called to get up quickly in order to serve as vigilant sentinels over the flock and to fight the good fight, never alone, but together with the holy and faithful people of God. I'm Christopher Wells.
Pope Francis on Wednesday published a new apostolic letter on the liturgical formation of the people of God. In the document, Pope Francis notes that a celebration that does not evangelize is not authentic, just as proclamation that does not lead to an encounter with the risen Lord in the celebration is not authentic. The document, titled Desiderio Desideravi, invites Christians to overcome sloppiness in liturgy and all forms of aestheticism that focus only on outward formality. Father Benedict Mayaki has the story.
Pope Francis's apostolic letter on liturgy, Desiderio Desideravi, aims to recall the profound meaning of Eucharistic celebrations and to encourage liturgical formation. Published on Wednesday, the Solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, the apostolic letter reaffirms the importance of ecclesial communion around the rites that emerged from the liturgical reform from the Second Vatican Council. In the letter, the Pope recalled the Constitution on Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, which led to the rediscovery of the theological understanding of the liturgy, and stressed that he wants the beauty of the Christian celebration and its necessary consequences for the life of the Church not to be spoiled by a superficial and foreshortened understanding of its value. In this regard, he warns against spiritual worldliness, inviting Christians rather to rediscover the beauty of the liturgy. He also insisted that every aspect of the celebration must be carefully tended to. The Pope goes on to insist on the importance of formation, first of all in seminaries, noting that a liturgical sapiential plan of studies will have a positive effect on pastoral formation. He also highlights the need to educate in the understanding of symbols, especially through cultivating the art of celebrating, which cannot be reduced to only a rubrical mechanism or to creativity without rules. Also, Pope Francis stresses the role of silence during the liturgy as it moves to sorrow for sin and the desire for conversion and disposes us to adore the body and blood of Christ. The Pope further notes that in Christian communities, their way of living out the celebration is conditioned, for better or for worse, by the way in which their pastor presides in the assembly. Thus, the Holy Father warns priests against rigid austerity or an exasperating creativity, a rushed briskness or an overemphasized slowness. To counter this, he invites priests to realize that to preside at the Eucharist is to be plunged into the furnace of God's love, which, when understood, will protect against these excesses. Concluding his apostolic letter, Pope Francis asks all bishops, priests and deacons, formators and seminaries to help the people of God to draw from what is the first wellspring of Christian spirituality, so that the Church may lift up, in a variety of languages, the same prayer capable of expressing unity. I'm Father Benedict Mayaki.
Also making international headlines, in Sri Lanka, doctors and bankers were among the hundreds of Sri Lankans who marched on Wednesday to demand that the government resolve a severe fuel shortage at the heart of the worst economic crisis in decades, or step down. Weeks of street demonstrations against cascading woes, such as power cuts and shortages of food and medicine, brought a change in government last month after 9 people were killed and about 300 others were injured in protests. And that brings us to the end of this edition of Vatican and World News. For more on these and other stories, including live coverage we invite you to visit our web portal at www.vaticannews.va. And don't forget to catch the latest updates from the Vatican and around the world on our Facebook page and our Twitter feed. Many thanks go to Adriano Vitali in the studio. In the Vatican, I'm Deborah Castellano-Lubov.
Laudato.
The Church is in Africa at the service of reconciliation, peace and justice. The Church is in Africa at the service of reconciliation, peace and justice.
This is the Africa service of Vatican Radio.
Welcome to our half-hour daily program for Africa.
In this edition today, our bulletin of church news to be followed by Panorama. Today we shall close with our feature of health and healing. My name is Kanyanta Godfrey Kampamba. Pope Francis on Wednesday celebrated Mass for the Solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, who are also the patron saints of the city of Rome. During the Mass, which was attended by a delegation sent by Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, the Pope blessed the palliums that are worn by new Catholic metropolitan archbishops of the world. And taking a cue from the Gospel reading of the day, the Holy Father also reminded the faithful that the Church is called to get up quickly and fight the good fight. Christopher Wells reports.
In his homily, Pope Francis reflected on the meaning of two phrases from the day's readings and what they mean for today's Christian community engaged in the synodal process. The first is from the Acts of the Apostles. St. Peter, the Pope recalled, had been imprisoned by Herod when an angel appeared to him, woke him, and ordered him to get up quickly. For Peter, this was the beginning of his escape from Herod's jail. Well, for the Church, the command to get up quickly stands as a call to enter into the mystery of the resurrection and allow the Lord to guide us along the paths he wishes to point out to us. The second phrase comes from St. Paul's letter to Timothy, where looking back on his whole life, the apostle says, "I have fought the good fight." St. Paul sees that fight going on throughout history, since many people are not disposed to accept Jesus. Pope Francis said Paul's exhortation is also a word of life for us today, helping us to realize that we are all called to be missionary disciples, with everyone offering their own contribution. The Pope then posed two questions for modern Christians. First, he said, we must ask ourselves, what can I do for the Church? He warned against complaining about the Church and invited the faithful instead to participate in the Church's work with passion and humility. This, he said, is what a synodal church means. Everyone has a part to play, no individual in the place of others or above others. Then he said we should ask, what can we do together as church to make the world in which we live more humane, just, and solidary, more open to God and to fraternity among people? This does not mean retreating into ecclesial circles, he said, but instead helping one another to be leaven in the dough of the world. In a word, he said, we're called to be a church that promotes the culture of care and compassion toward the vulnerable. Finally, recalling the fine tradition of the blessing of the Pallia, Pope Francis reminded the archbishops that they too are called to get up quickly in order to serve as vigilant sentinels over the flock and to fight the good fight, never alone, but together with the holy and faithful people of God. I'm Christopher Wells.
Soon after the Eucharistic celebration on the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, Pope Francis recited the traditional Angelus prayer, beginning by reflecting on the Gospel reading of the day taken from St. Matthew, in which Peter says to Jesus, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." The Pope then focused on the struggles and imperfections of the apostles in their faith and noted that for the fisherman Simon, later called Peter, it was the beginning of a journey and that it would indeed have to be a long time before the scope of those words entered deeply into his life, involving him entirely. Then the Holy Father pointed out the fact that the two apostles experienced an apprenticeship of faith, a journey that men faithful likewise face. We too believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, but it takes time, patience, and much humility for our way of thinking and acting to fully adhere to the gospel. Even if our faith journey is imperfect, the Pope said, we can ask Saints Peter and Paul to teach us how to always increase our trust in the Lord and grow closer to Him. Following his gospel reflection, Pope Francis decried the bombing of the Kremenchuk shopping center in Ukraine and prayed that God might open the path to dialogue as the war wages on in Ukraine. Speaking in his Angelus address from the study window of the Apostolic Palace, he also addressed a number of issues, including an appeal for the protection of the environment following serious fires that have broken out in Rome in recent days as the Italian capital smolders in extreme heat. Devin Watkins has this report.
Pope Francis today appealed for dialogue and an end to the war in Ukraine as a Russian missile strike struck a shopping mall in the central city of Kremenchuk. He made the appeal after the Angelus prayer for the feast of Saints Peter and Paul.
Porto ogni giorno nel cuore la cara e martoriata Ucraina.
Every day, the Pope said, I carry in my heart the dear and tormented Ukraine, which continues to be scourged by barbaric attacks, such as the one that struck the Kremenchuk shopping center. At least 18 people were killed on Monday in what Kiev said was a direct Russian missile strike against the busy shopping center. The G7 called the strike a Russian war crime, while Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russia of directly targeting civilians. Moscow rejected those accounts, saying it had hit a legitimate military target in the city and that the shopping center was not in use. In his appeal, Pope Francis called for nations to come to the assistance of the Ukrainian people, who he said are suffering so much.
Prego questa folle guerra possa vedere presto la fine.
I pray that this mad war may soon see an end, and I renew the invitation to persevere without tiring in prayer for peace, he said. May the Lord open paths of dialogue that men are unable or unwilling to find. Separately, Pope Francis also appealed for the protection of the environment following a series of fires that broke out in Rome in recent days as the Italian capital smolders in extreme heat. He pointed out that in many places, drought is now a serious problem which is causing serious damage to production activities and the environment. The Pope expressed his hope that the necessary measures will be put in place to deal with these emergencies and to prevent future emergencies.
Non è una moda, è una responsabilità.
All this, he said, must make us reflect on the protection of creation. It is not a fad, he concluded, but a responsibility. The future of the earth is in our hands and our decisions. I'm Devin Watkins.
At the end of the Angelus on Wednesday for the Solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, Pope Francis invited the faithful gathered in St. Peter's Square to get a copy of the first edition of the Osservatore di Strada, a new magazine written with and dedicated to the poor and marginalized. The monthly magazine is produced by the Osservatore Romano and was distributed for free to anyone interested by volunteers in the square. Produced by the Vatican's Dicastery for Communication, the aim of the magazine is to give a voice to the poor and the marginalized, and it is dedicated to art, stories, and opinions of those whose stories, art, and voices are often not heard or are ignored. The monthly magazine will be published on the first Sunday of each month, both in print and online. The distribution of hard copies would take place every Sunday after the Pope's Angelus near St. Peter's Square. Through the help of experts, everyone will be given a chance to contribute so that everyone can be on the same level, given the same dignity and the same respect. The Vatican on Wednesday published a letter of Pope Francis on the liturgy entitled Desiderio Desideravi. The letter is written nearly 1 year after the Pope issued the motu proprio Traditionis Custodes, restricting the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass. In the 15-page apostolic letter, Desiderio Desideravi, the Pope says he wants to invite the whole Church to rediscover, to safeguard, and to live the truth and power of the Christian celebration. I want the beauty of the Christian celebration and its necessary consequences for the life of the Church not to be spoiled by a superficial and foreshortened understanding of its value, or worse yet, by its being exploited in service of some ideological vision, regardless of the type, the Holy Father said in the document published on June 29th, the Solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul. The title of the letter is taken from the Latin text of Luke chapter 22, verse 15, Desiderio Desideravi hoc pascam anducare vobiscum antiquam patia, which in English translates as, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. In the letter, Pope Francis is calling for liturgical formation beyond the academic environment to be accessible to all Catholics in order to revive a sense of wonder at the mystery of the sacrifice of the Mass. You are tuned to the Daily Africa service of Vatican Radio.
African News Panorama.
The Kenyan government is planning to build safe houses in Saudi Arabia for migrant workers who are victims of abuse. Reports of Kenyan domestic workers being subjected to serious maltreatment by their Saudi employers are frequent, in some cases resulting in death. The government had allocated 70 million Kenyan shillings or 594,000 United States dollars for the purpose, and attempts were being made to actively look for Kenyans who are suffering in the Middle East. The government said the number of Kenyans working and living in Saudi Arabia rose from 55,000 in 2019 to 97,000 in 2022, and most of them are domestic workers, according to data from Kenya's Parliamentary Labour and Social Welfare Committee. The government said it was going to strictly enforce the requirement that all recruiting agents register with the country's National Employment Authority before sending Kenyans to work abroad. Police in riot gear in Ghana's capital, Accra, on Wednesday gathered at the El Wak Sports Stadium ahead of a second day of planned protests over the rising cost of living. The stadium is about 1.5 kilometers from the president's office, Jubilee House. It was feared that the protesters from the Arise Ghana group may try to march from the stadium to the office, but that route has been banned by the authorities. On Tuesday, 29 people were arrested after a largely peaceful protest descended into chaos when police and protesters clashed. Mali's military authorities have announced that a presidential election to usher in civilian rule will be held in February 2024. The announcement was made after a detailed timetable for reforms and legislative and presidential polls was adopted following consultations between the interim government and political stakeholders on Tuesday. The first and second rounds of the legislative elections will be held in October and November 2023, respectively. A constitutional referendum will also be held in March 2023, ahead of local elections scheduled for June 2023. On 6th June, the junta unilaterally announced that the transitional period had been set for 24 months. The poll timetable was released ahead of a summit of the Economic Community of West African States, which is expected to make a decision on whether to lift or extend sanctions it imposed on Mali in January. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has joined in the chorus of condemnation after at least 23 migrants died as Moroccan security forces tried to stop them crossing into the Spanish enclave of Melilla last week. In a statement issued on Twitter, he said he was shocked by the violence. The use of excessive force is unacceptable, and the human rights and dignity of people on the move must be prioritized by countries, he added. Between 1,500 and 2,000 migrants who had been camping in the Moroccan mountains surrounding Melilla descended on the city's border last Friday, a number of them carrying sticks, hoping to scale the border fences and therefore reach Spanish territory. In the chaos that followed, many of them were crushed between the 6-meter-high fences and Moroccan border guards who used tear gas and batons on the migrants. On Sunday, the head of the African Union Commission, Moussa Faki Mahamat, expressed his shock and concern at the violent and degrading treatment of African migrants. You are tuned to the Daily Africa service of Vatican Radio.
And now, our feature, Health and Healing. Mental health is one of the aspects of our well-being that continues to receive less attention on the African continent. Mental health refers to cognitive, behavioral, and emotional well-being. In short, it is all about how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. Someone who is mentally sick is often referred to as having a mental disorder. There are many types of mental disorders, and these include anxiety, depression, paranoia, which is the irrational and persistent feeling that people are out to harm you. Psychosis, where a person experiences delusions, visions, and confused thinking. Schizophrenia, which involves disruptions to thinking and emotions, and a distorted perception of reality. And disassociation, which is a process where a person disconnects from their thoughts, feelings, memories, or sense of identity. In this edition, we examine a project in the Catholic Diocese of Wa in Ghana, where volunteers, including the diocesan bishop, Cardinal Designate Richard Bawobri, are engaged in helping people who are mentally sick. According to the World Health Organization, mental disorder is on the rise in Ghana. About 1 million people suffer from a serious mental disorder, and more than 2.5 million others suffer from either moderate or mild mental disorder. The country has large hospitals with psychiatric departments, but unfortunately using outdated approaches to mental illness. There are also small centers that use modern approaches, but these are private and out of reach for majority of the mentally ill patients. Added to these challenges is the practice of abandoning mentally ill people by their relatives. Often, these abandoned patients move to towns where they become victims of isolation and harassment. Cardinal designate Richard Bawobri is one of the 21 who will be created cardinals by Pope Francis on 27th August this year. He was appointed Bishop of War in 2016. He found the project that helps mentally ill people already operating in the diocese. He relaunched it and involved the parishes, the clergy, religious, and lay people in it. Today, it has volunteers who bring food, clothing, and other necessities to the mentally ill who live on the streets of the town of War. Cardinal designate Bawobri spoke to Vatican Radio.
Actually, they existed before I came. I just gave them a little push and accompanied them. I encouraged them from time to time. This whole life, a group that started preparing food to distribute to the mentally challenged and then to the beggars in town. And when I came at the end of the year of mercy, I reflected with the rest of the diocese to say, okay, what do we do as our act of mercy beyond continue to show mercy to those who are most in need? Then in discussing, I said, okay, there is this group that is doing something to the most vulnerable of the society because the mentally challenged, they cannot survive otherwise apart from charity. So I said, okay, how about this group? Can we not come to the help of this group? So we started, and then the Sunday of Divine Mercy, when we take the collection, we say, okay, 50% should come to the diocesan administration, and then 50% they should keep in their parishes to help those who are poor and mentally challenged also in where they are. And then what they send us, together with other help we get from elsewhere, we try to feed the mentally challenged. So sometimes I go out myself, like tomorrow I'm going out with a group to serve the food to the mentally challenged in the streets of town before I come and celebrate the Eucharist with them. So we have seen that it is a help, but we need to go beyond that. So what we want to do is, if we get funds, to build a center where we can, when they are sick, we can at least offer them a shelter where they can be treated, cleaned, etc. And from where we can cook the food and bring it to them also. That is the idea. That is what we are doing. We got some help to start the building, but we've not gone very far. But we are still hopeful that we've got further support to continue. That is something that came as a result of the Year of Mercy that Pope Francis had decreed. And then afterwards, we wanted to have a concrete expression of mercy, living mercy, beyond the Year of Mercy in the diocese. That's how we put that.
That is very interesting. And another interesting thing that was noted, that it is not the patients who are actually coming around to look for help. It is actually your volunteers who go around looking for these people.
Yes, yes. We go around the market, look for them, and when we see them, we give them the food, or if they need medical attention, we bring them to the hospital, etc. Yeah. We go around to meet them.
How serious is this problem of mental health in your region there?
The town has a certain attraction. Many people think that in town they can improve their life. And when they come, if they are not prepared, of course, and they don't know anybody easily, they can find themselves in very, very depressing situations. And if they are not mentally strong, you can really get sick. So the town challenges the pressure of life and all those conditions, hardship conditions, etc. That causes some of that. For some of them, it is from past negative experiences that they develop that sickness. And we try to see, okay, if we cannot help them, at least we try not to harm them. That's the message that we try to pass. If you cannot help them, don't harm them at least. Because it has happened in some cases that when they are begging for food, some people have not welcomed them and have treated them badly. And you see them walking around town, you see them in the streets, some places. They are not only limited to the Wat town itself, but I've seen some in the villages. On the whole, many of them are peaceful, but there are some who maybe because of what they drink or what they take, they can be violent. But otherwise, on the whole, they are peaceful. And we try to educate people to consider them as their brothers. I remember one day we were going around distributing the food, and then one of the men who was sitting next to one of them who were going to give the food, he said, "Oh, He's smart. I said, no, he's not smart. He's my brother. So he said, oh. So he thought that he was actually my blood brother. So I said, he is also your brother. He's also your brother. And he said, oh, I didn't know. I said, yes, he's also your brother. So that type of conversation, it does help people to rethink their position towards them, to consider them as brothers, not as people who are off their mind completely. It happens they are sick, like we all fall sick, but we hope that with the affection and the little support we give, they can get out of their situation one day.
We even came to know that sometimes we have even gone to the media to speak about mental health and how these people could be helped. You go to television, or you write in newspapers, or you go to radio stations?
It's mainly through the radio stations and through interviews like yours now, yeah. And when we get the occasion, through the homilies, the mass and interaction.
What do you tell the people exactly about the way they should handle these people who are mentally sick?
Basically, I try to share with them the message that there are people who are vulnerable, who need support, and they should be helped. If we cannot, as I said, if you cannot help them, at least don't harm them. Just welcome them as brothers, smile towards them. Even if you cannot give them anything, you smile towards the person, you see that person, it can change something in the person. And if you really can give them something, so much the better. It has happened that some groups, because of that, on their initiative, they have contributed either food or cash or clothing to go themselves and join the group to go and give them, or to give to the group that is helping them so that they can have something. Yeah. So I'm happy with that reaction. So some take the message seriously. So basically it's just to say, okay, there are brothers and sisters who are sick. So just as you visit the sick people in the hospital and help them, also visit them, help them. Don't despise them. That is the type of message of brotherhood, fraternity.
Does the diocese have some healthy facilities, let me say, a dispensary or a hospital?
There is a regional hospital with a psychiatric department where we used to get one of the psychiatric nurses to accompany the group, and he was very instrumental. But now he has gone out of the country, so he proposed somebody else to join the group. Cases that really need attention, we bring them there to see if they can help them, and they have been helpful sometimes. What we have seen is, for example, somebody who is sick and he begins the treatment, if he's not followed, and it's difficult to follow them because they take the medicine and then they go on their own, and or sometimes they might be suspicious that you put the medicine in the food, so they will not eat. So it's difficult to follow them. That's why we want now, if we get support, to build a center where cases like that, there can be a follow-up. Either we bring them to the place, clean them, give them a place where they can rest, and then ensure that they follow the medication. At least they can be reintegrated into their family once they recover a bit, and then they involve the family. That is the idea. The health facilities, they are overcrowded, and they tend not to be attended to if they were to walk in on their own. On their own, if they walk in there, they will not be treated. But with the presence of the psychiatric nurse, we have been fortunate that sometimes we've got the help we needed for them.
Bishop, what challenges do you face in this project? Things that limit your activities, especially in taking care of these people?
There is still a mentality change that has to take place, discrimination, and in some cases, fear. Some people are afraid that, okay, if you to be too close to the person can do you harm. And in some places, the belief of witchcraft, etc., say the person must have been involved in bad things, that is why the person is like that. So there's that fear, psychological challenge, I would say. The material challenge is there in terms of the center, in terms of the food, sometimes that we don't have enough resources to buy the food in order to serve them. We buy and we use what people donate. Those are some of the things. And of course, in terms of following them up, being able to help them in the way that we should is difficult because today they are here and another time they are somewhere else. So you really have to comb the town to be sure that you're meeting them. And added to that is the fact that with the economic difficulty crisis throughout the world now, in addition to the mentally challenged, there are some poor people who also need help. initially the food was cooked just for the mentally challenged. But when we go out distributing and we see somebody who is poor, who is also begging, we cannot refuse to give some of the food to the person also. So we give the food also to that person. So it means that maybe sometimes we run short of the food packages for those who we consider are most in need, because there are other needy persons who have been added to the list now. But we say, okay, at the end of the day, they also need it. So if they can be helped a little bit, that is fine.
Bishop, that's all that I had. If you have anything to add on what we have said, you are welcome.
Let us pray for them. Let us support them. And for myself, for my new ministry also, I need prayers that I continue to serve the local church and the universal church wherever I'm needed.
Cardinal Designate Richard Bawobri, the Bishop of Wa, speaking there from the town of Wa in Ghana. And that was Health and Healing for this week. This has been Johnny Baptist Tomosime.
This is the Africa service of Vatican Radio. Praised be Jesus Christ. Laudetur Jesus Christus.
The church is in Africa at the service of reconciliation, peace and justice. The church is in Africa at the service of reconciliation, peace and justice.